Hello, and welcome to Stories Across Borders. Here we discuss stories told across a range of different mediums, books, movies, comics, games, you name it. Our one rule is that we can only discuss things in terms of the story itself. Anything like acting, art, or mechanics is out unless it directly relates to the way the story is being told. I am Daniel Radford, author, Cape Geek, and also your host, and today I am joined by Keith James and Andy Chupa from Sonner and Desert Media's Brockton Bay Chronicles podcast.
Hello, Daniel. Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, excited to be here, Daniel.
Excited to have you. And excited to have you here for this, because today does mark a momentous occasion for Stories Across Borders, and arguably for me. So depending on your tolerance levels, audience, you'll be pleased to hear this one, because today, after mentioning this story at least once every couple of episodes, we are finally doing an episode about J.C. McCrae's superhero web serial Worm. And that means there's a slim chance that I will stop telling you to read it all the time.
We're excited to have a chance to discuss this with you.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know Keith and Andy's podcast, if you guys want to sort of explain a little bit about who you are and what you do, that'd be fantastic.
Sure, I guess I'll start. This idea came to me. First of all, my stepson was the one who got me to read Worm. And after finishing it, I was eager to talk about it with someone. And I managed to convince my good friend, Andy, to have a look at the story and see if he would be interested in doing this as a podcast. And yeah, I was fortunate that he was able to find interest and bite on it.
And Keith had mentioned this to me a couple times before, as far as Worm goes. And I read a lot. Usually, I have a stack of stuff going on, and hadn't found time to fit it in, but had been kicking around the idea of podcasting on some other topics. And so when he brought this up, I thought it was a pretty cool idea. The one really hard part has been the format that he decided on, whereby I have to just read a small chunk every 2 weeks and then put it aside until the next episode.
Yeah, to explain exactly what we're doing, obviously I've read Worm, and in order to make this thing work, I said, "Hey, we'll follow a format from another podcast. I hope it's okay for me to mention.
Go for it.
We've got Worm, and I use them as kind of a template, kind of an inspiration, and we put our own spin on it. So Andy, despite the fact he is a voracious reader, has to only read certain segments of arcs that we're going to cover on a given episode, and that's kind of the dynamic. He reads, gives his thoughts and opinions. At the end of each arc, we come up with his selection for what we call our key character of the arc. Andy, why don't you kind of give an overview of what key character of the arc means for you?
Sure. This is the character that stood out to me the most, but also trying to be a little bit selective about it, in the sense that not going for the easy pick, the easy one to choose. Um, so, for instance, in the section where the Undersiders were fighting against the Slaughterhouse Nine, there was an epic battle between Skidder and Mannequin, and this random guy who was being threatened by Mannequin kind of came out of nowhere and helped Skidder, and was really instrumental in helping take down Mannequin, or at least cause him to withdraw from that particular battle. And so he was my key character of the arc, and much to my happy surprise, Forrester showed back up just recently as one of her lieutenants. So it's a fun little thing that we add to the podcast when we wrap up an arc.
That is actually a very cool. I don't know if that came across. Apologies to anyone who just heard the random crow in the background. Yeah, that's a really cool idea, actually. I like that quite a lot.
Yeah, I was looking for something different, something to set us apart from what other folks might have done already.
That's really good, actually. If I ever do like a bit play by play over a story over like a podcast like that, I might borrow that. That's really neat. But yeah, so getting into the story itself, a brief overview of what Worm is and what it's about for anyone who hasn't managed to piece it together from me going on and on about it all of the time. Uh, it is a web serial, so long form fiction released in chunks for free online. If you just search Worm web serial, you will be able to find it quite easily. It is a story about Taylor, later going by the name Skidder, who develops powers related to controlling insects and kind of intends to become a hero, but ends up falling in with a bunch of villains instead. And it deals with a lot with complicated morality and some interesting world building stuff, a dose of realism to the superhero genre, and a bunch of things like that. It's very good, and we'll be talking a lot about it going forward, so I won't just spam you, I suppose, with a bunch of superfluous details. uh, so just as a sort of general catch-all to get us started, I think, what do you guys like about the story? Because obviously you must enjoy it somewhat if you are doing this whole podcast about it.
Well, when my stepson told me what it was about, I wasn't sure it was going to be my cup of tea. But I found the writing pretty accessible. I mean, I believe this is aimed at kind of a younger audience anyway. Andy and I are of a certain age, so to speak. But I am a sci-fi geek, and so I was drawn in. And for me, Wildbow's ability to write his characters is what kind of captured me. And the deeper into the story I got, I think safe to say that the superhero battles themselves, while an integral part and very interesting, it's not a superhero story about a girl. It's a girl who happens to be a superhero or a cape, if you will. And her character moments interacting with like her dad and her inner monologues are pretty fascinating. And that's kind of what kept me into the story as much as anything else.
Yeah, I
And
agree with you very much on that one, that there is a lot of focus on like character philosophies and growth and like inter-character drama, so I think that's a good shout.
and when Keith recommended this to me, I recalled that he had recommended a series by Larry Niven that, well, I guess Larry Niven was kind of the driver behind it, but he opened it up to a lot of people, called Man Kazin Wars. And Keith and I used to talk about those stories. And so I thought, well, if Keith signs off on this, I'm probably going to like it. As we said earlier, I read a lot. I wasn't a huge comic book guy back as a kid, but I definitely enjoyed it. Uh, and The thing I like the most about Worm, I think, is just that it is a different take on things. It's darker. It does get into the gray areas more. Uh, it's uh, it's more unpredictable.
Mhm.
One of the things that, if you read enough stories, if you watch enough movies, it kind of gets to the point where it's like, all right, well, I feel a little tense right now, but I know everything's going to turn out okay. This is Marvel. Nobody's going to die, or if they do, they're going to come back. So for this to come up right off the bat, people, dying right and left in some of these early arcs, and the main character having to decide that she's going to inflict pretty harmful damage on folks, really drew me in as a differentiator, if you will. And but I'm kind of the opposite of Keith. I love the battle scenes. I live for that part of it. Wild Bow does a great job of describing those, and I really sink my teeth into that part.
And as a normie, I want to piggyback off of what Andy said about the unpredictability of this story. Um, as someone who did not read even the amount of comic books growing up as Andy did, I think I looked for some of those or expected some of those predictable turns in a story. And when they didn't come, I tended to be frustrated. but I think that's more about me than the story itself. I would be frustrated that the predictable thing didn't happen, and Wild Bow would take us on down this other fork in the road, so to speak.
That's interesting you say that, because I was going to ask if there was anything perhaps that you were less fond of in the story as well, just as an interesting contrast point, something to build off of. And so I suppose that could be yours.
Yeah, only in the very mildest of terms. Things that dissatisfied me. Well, without getting too spoilery, I guess there are aspects of Taylor's journey throughout the story, some significant points where the normie in me, the superhero genre normie in me, is thinking, "No, don't do that. I want you to end up eventually being a good guy. Don't make that decision." So there was a lot of that for me during my first read.
I agree with that. I I had shared early on with Keith that, you know, back when I played a lot of role playing games, I was always the paladin. I was always the goody two shoes. And the one time I tried to play a villainous character, I had to keep making alignment checks, and I eventually ended up being a goody two shoes anyway. So um, I was rooting for Taylor to, successfully be a double agent, and actually end up being part of the protectorate, and really figuring that was going to happen. And my predictions obviously were not correct, and that was a bit of a shock to me. But uh, I think it's very believable the way Wild Bow has
Yeah,
written that,
yeah.
and so that's made it less painful to me that I was wrong, but it's more realistic, I think, if a parahuman alternate universe story can be said to be realistic. I think it can.
Well, I mean, the thing with realism, right, is it doesn't have to mean realistic, I think.
Good
Realism
point.
is more about the world having an internal logic, and I think the big thing is that there are consequences for actions and events that make sense within the scope of the story's reality.
That's true. And I don't think that at any point the story strays from the dynamics, the mechanisms that are set up for it. When you run into a new cape that Wild Bow brings into the story, within a sentence or two, you can understand how his or her powers work. And they don't seem to, as Andy would say, make you press the believe button within this universe. And it's pretty consistent.
Yeah, I think as a general, the way powers are done is very consistent, and how the powers work and where they come from is a mystery within the series that it does
Yeah.
explore to an extent later on without saying anything too spoilery. That's something for Andy to look forward to.
Yeah, we've already seen glimpses of that with the trigger vision, and it's kind of aligned with some themes and other items I've read, and so that's been really interesting to speculate about. And Keith periodically says, "Well, what do you think? Where's this going to go?" And then I have to try to prognosticate about
Good
that.
luck.
And I think yeah. I don't think I've got a very good percentage on that being correct, but it's fun to speculate.
Yeah, so you guys have touched on a lot of the things that I really liked about the story as well, because I had a similar experience going in that Keith mentioned, where it was recommended to me by a friend who, you know, I knew their writing and stuff. I knew that they were good at storytelling, but we had never really talked much about like shared interests in media and things like that. So I went into it going, okay, a superhero story, let's go. And then was like, oh, okay, never mind, I love it. And uh, now, even though I haven't talked to this person in years, I'm still talking about this story. So, and the things that ended up drawing me to it are very much the same things you guys talked about. The fact that it has this dose of realism to it. It has world building that makes sense and is internally consistent, which is something that lacks in so many other superhero stories. Beyond it all, just the way the characters are written with such nuance and depth and intriguing philosophies and moralities. I'm all about that stuff.
One thing, we're at a point in the story now where I wouldn't say the world is complete, but there are circles being closed here. Things that setups and payoffs, I guess, is the way to look at it. There are things that are coming to fruition that, as Andy noted, with the reappearance of Forrest from the S9 arc, we get a payoff where that character reappears, and then we get a payoff later on where somebody makes a reference to something that happened back in arc 5. Um, just this last episode, to step a little further ahead, Andy, you and I talked about the consistency of the characters in Wild Bill's writing across this vast story.
Yeah, that's a great point. It is very internally consistent, and I think we've only had one or two times where I've kind of raised an objection to things, and it's mainly due to my interpretation of something or my particular perspective on something. The one thing that I think Wildbow does a great job of is that, and is lacking in a lot of the other superhero stuff, is that at the base of it, Taylor is a high school student, and one minute she's battling to kind of save the world or at least her corner of it, and then the next minute she's got a geometry test or the equivalent of that, and it's it's easy to lose track of it in the midst of a battle or planning what they're going to do in a particular environment, and then she has to go back to school or interact with her dad, and you're like, oh yeah, I would be just that immature when I was, or, I'd be lucky to be doing that well when I was that age. So that's another great aspect about it that really highlights the realism, makes it very believable.
Yeah, Taylor is, I think, a fascinating choice of protagonist because partly because of the way she views the world, but also the way she ends up where she's going and the consistency in how she thinks and acts and does things.
Mhm.
Like for her, at first, becoming an actual cape, doing something with her powers, aiming to be a hero, is escapism from the absolutely horrible way she is treated in her school life and her traumas and things related to that. Right, which is it's really easy to see how that origin point has shaped her worldview and leads her to each point she gets to. So it is very consistent. Like even though she does inevitably eventually become a villain, even as a villain, she is still acting in a way that she believes is morally correct for the most part. She still believes she is doing right on the grander scale.
Yeah, I think that statement holds true with her as a character. I want to touch back on the more intimate relations between her and her father. That's something that I've harped on. The scenes where she and her dad are agonizing over their broken relationship, I found very believable, really enjoyable, depressing at times, which is a tribute to the fact that he's that Wild Bill has successfully gotten inside my head and made this conversation believable to me.
Oh yeah, some of the best writing in the story isn't when Taylor is out in costume. It's after the fact when she's got back and she's struggling to deal with the double life of
Right.
lying to her dad. It's like every time they interact and you feel that relationship breaking just a little bit more is like a kick in the teeth, and I kind of love it.
I do want to champion something, Andy's opinion when it comes to the battles themselves. The Leviathan arc. The first time that I read that, I think it's fair to say I was pretty scared for her. Okay, when she first fought Lung, when she first came out into wearing her costume and how that went. Okay, that was a little scary, but now she's helping the heroes fight this kaiju essentially, and it was nerve wracking.
The Leviathan arc is actually my favorite arc in Worm, based on everything like the emotions surrounding it into the lead up and then into that
Hmm.
very intense action. and it's the first time in this, like, we've had reason to believe that things could go badly for people before, but it's the first time in the story that you get a real taste of how dangerous Cape life actually is, how bad this world is to live in a lot of ways, how the horrible things that are out there that that are so bad that collectively hero and villain alike fear them and stand against them together because it's the only way they might survive. And as a like behind the curtain kind of thing, now I don't know, admittedly, I don't know how true this is, but I've read in multiple places that Waldo, J.C. McCrae, whichever one we want to go with, was actually rolling dice to determine which characters would live or die in that arc.
And my stepson confirmed that to me. That was the deal.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if I'm remembering this correctly, I don't even think Taylor was supposed to live.
She was not
And
exempt from the dice rolls, which is
Mhm.
insane to me. I could never write a story like that. If I'm gonna kill off a character, I probably know I'm gonna do that since like chapter 1. The idea of just rolling a dice and being like, well, new protagonist. That takes a level of confidence that I do not possess.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. That was a really intense arc, and I really love the way, especially he described Tattletale's analysis of Leviathan, um, and how she used her power to try to tap into what they were up against, and that I really, I don't know if it's because of my line of work or just the way my mind works, working with computers all the time, but I really get into the analysis stuff and the data processing stuff that Taylor does with her swarm as her powers continue to expand.
That I mean, they're both fascinating, like powers in general. The powers system, like the powers people end up with, are really interesting in how they work a lot of the time. So I'm with you, even as someone who knows barely anything about computers. I'm with you on that. And Tattletales specifically is a really interesting one to follow if you're trying to piece together like the world building and the way things
Mm.
function, because of the way it works with the way her power is just deduction, basically putting things together from scraps of information. And then you have like the realization she has about Leviathan, for example, completely shakes how you view the world, because it changes it's a paradigm shift in a way, because you're like, wait, what? How does that make sense?
Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
And
One thing that I've always said that I found fascinating was the limits on the powers that Wildbow comes up with. They're to me almost as interesting as the powers themselves, and then the items that he uses, like the Manton effect, to keep those that concept. I think Andy, didn't I reference once the Manton effect not dissimilar to like the Prime Directive? It's one thing it's there hovering over the story, but you don't think about it until it's actually brought up in perhaps a conversation.
Yeah, you did mention that, and I thought that was a good analogy, because just like the Prime Directive, there's always folks that are trying to figure out if it's a firm thing, if there's if the boundary, if that envelope should be pushed or if it can be. And so you've got folks that are, experimenting in different ways, seeing if something can be, there's a loophole. And yeah, I think that was a good analogy with the Prime Directive.
I mean, the Mansion effect is something very interesting, because the in-universe understanding of it grows and changes as the story goes on as well. Because, I don't want to spoil anything too much, but the basic understanding at the beginning is roughly powers have inbuilt limits to prevent them from causing harm to the user, and
Right.
as a general rule, powers will either affect the biological or the non-biological. It's very rare that you get a power that can affect both. It's very rare that you get powers that do not apply to the Manton limit, for example. So
Right. And I think I remember to get a little deeper, there was that one interlude with one of the triumvirate when their first battle against Behemoth, and the shock of one of the heroes that there was no Manton limits, and the character said, "How do we even fight this?"
Exactly.
Mm.
A fairly consistent thing is that any character that can break or subvert the Manton limit is a character that everyone else is at least a little concerned about. Even if they're like friends or allies, they're like, I don't want to be on your bad side, ever.
For
Um,
sure.
but you also, Andy, mentioned, I think it was Andy mentioned, finding that the limitations to the powers are more interesting a lot of the time than the powers themselves, and that I agree with that wholeheartedly. Brandon Sanderson, you are probably familiar with him, but he actually has a thing he calls like the laws of magic, and I think it's the second one of those is that limitations to powers are always more interesting than powers, and Worm goes all in on that, and I love it because it's true. It's way more interesting to see a character get given a limited toolkit and then have to
Mhm.
figure out how to make it work than it is to watch a character who can do basically anything.
You liken that to your dislike of Superman.
Yeah, well, there is that. You've got those Deus ex machina type people that just the hand of God. Whatever they want to do, they can accomplish. Like Dr. Manhattan, and it is annoying, and it's kind of like, oh well, that just throws everything off. But yeah, I fondly remember. Oh, go ahead.
I was like, it's very funny that you've said this because every single episode in this cycle has at least one comment about Superman. And it's always something, and it's very funny because I always find myself talking in defense of the character, which because I used to not like him as a character either, and like he's still not my favorite by any means, but I've kind of come around to the idea because the idea of Superman is never about what can he or can he not do with his powers. It's about the morality, the struggle of not doing
Mm,
everything. It's it's never about how hard can he punch the enemy away. It's can he do that and still save everybody. It's the fact that he always has to do the hard thing and the morally correct thing, even when it is incredibly difficult. And when you shift the lens to look at it like that, it becomes a much more interesting character. Do I think he's as interesting to watch play out as someone who doesn't have all that and still has to deal with those things? No, but it does reframe my appreciation of him a little bit. I think part of the problem is just that the character has been very badly mishandled in more recent media.
yeah, I haven't followed Superman in quite a while. I guess I did watch Justice League, and but I don't think I watched the Batman versus Superman one where he actually died.
Yeah,
So I don't
you
know how
don't.
that happened.
It's one of the very few movies that has a very distinct special honor in that it's one of I think two or three movies that I've fallen asleep during.
Oh, wow.
Wow. Wow, that's
I
that's saying something.
and I have problems sleeping.
Well, now you've got a cure, right? I mean, just pop in Batman versus Superman, but not to make light of that. That's a rough thing to have. But wow, yeah, I
Yeah. And then like you look at Worm and how it handles like its characters, even the powerful ones, and you're like, there is no reason that other superhero stories have to be like that. Like,
Yeah, yeah. Even the villains in Worm, the ones who are more toward the evil side than our Taylor here, Wildbow doesn't just, how do I want to say this? They aren't evil for evil's sake. Even I mean, he takes the courageous step, I think, of giving a certain amount of depth to like Empire 88 even.
yeah,
Um,
he makes the
the
Nazis
closest,
people. It's
yeah,
very
yeah,
funny.
he exactly, and I tip my hat to him because it makes the story A more believable and B more interesting. It's just not generic bald guy doing bad things. There is a what they see a motive, a method to their madness. It's evil, but it's there's a purpose to it.
Yeah, the people in Worm are people. They're multifaceted and nuanced and complicated, and it's not always as simple as just this person is evil. It's usually they're evil because they have X
Hmm.
goal. Or then you have characters like Purity, who I think is a very interesting character. Guess who she's aligned with, going by her name audience?
Yeah.
Who she's not a good guy at all. She's very clearly a villain with a very warped and arguably cruel perspective of the world. But she wanted to be a hero. She thinks she is doing the right thing. And it's very interesting, and like she cares about her family and things like that. It's very interesting to get into her head when that happens. Because it's like, if you had just gone on a slightly different trajectory, if you had just a couple of better influences in your life at some point, if you didn't grow up as part of this life, perhaps, if something had gone different for you, you could have been an amazing hero.
Agreed. Yeah.
And
But every once in a while, Wild Bow throws in somebody like the merchants, and you're just like, yeah, okay, there's
Hmm.
the people I was looking for that are
yeah,
just the
See,
normal
yes, yeah.
pond scum, so he doesn't leave us hanging. He doesn't, totally take away all the stuff we're used to.
I mean, every city is going to have its local thugs, and that's basically
Exactly.
all the merchants are. Is that they're your low level thugs and gangsters and petty criminals,
Right.
and some of them just happen to have powers, which is
Mm.
great because one of my favorite things about Worm is that it's never let's attach a person to the power. It's always let's attach a power to the person.
Hmm.
Yeah, and it keeps it interesting. I remember one trip, my wife and I listened to the audiobook. And so there was one 5 hour drive my wife and I were making on a weekend trip. And I put this thing in, and I'm listening enthralled and on whatever particular part I was covering at the time. I think it was pretty early on in the story. And yeah, I'm just enthralled in this thing. So Andy brought up the merchants, and I think early on in our podcast, this was one of the first times I brought up the possibility of Wild Bow making just kind of two-dimensional characters. I thought every up until that point, everybody, no matter how brief they were on the stage, seemed to have some depth to them. But Andy, you remember that conversation? You kind of explained where we couldn't really give depth to everybody.
Yeah, I do recall that. And yeah, it's in any universe you're going to always have some folks that are just the stand-ins, if you will, or just the folks in the background, and they're they play a part in the story, but they're not going to have the same depth. It would be the reader, I don't think, would be
Hmm.
able to keep everything straight in their head if everybody had a big backstory. So you name somebody Skid Mark, and right away you kind of know that they're probably not going to be around a long time and not have a big role.
I was amazed that he had as much staying power as he did. Um,
Yeah.
but I mean that you nailed it. Like, it's impossible from a writing and a reading perspective for every character to have even a fraction of the depth that a lot of the characters in Worm have. And the thing is, uh, it's an enormous cast of characters, most of which
Yeah.
appear more than just once or twice. Most of them are repeatedly occurring characters because the Cape scene is kind of a closed circle in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
Everyone knows of each other if you're significant enough to be known of. It's just the way it is. There's a wiki, but uh, but so many of those characters have a surprising amount of depth, or at least enough depth implied that you feel the layers, and that's one of my one of my favorite things about the story is how nuanced and complicated and fascinating the characters are.
It's one of the benefits that doing this podcast with Andy. Andy's the big brain in our friendship, and doing this with him, when he puts out a response to a question I may have, he often triggers me to dig for deeper layers in the story itself. And so, even though this is my second read, it's been immensely enjoyable as I've discovered new layers to the characters, and Andy's been able to challenge some of my initial assumptions on things.
Yeah, I mean that's what I love about it. Like, just a character being a villain doesn't necessarily make them pure evil. They have complicated motives, and a character being a hero technically doesn't necessarily mean they're a good person. It's
Right.
just even that starting point from the beginning makes for a very interesting dynamic, because you can't trust labels. You have to get to understand what this character is up to and where they fit in, what their motivations are. You can't just go, that's a hero, everything's gonna be okay, because sometimes the hero is a bastard. Looking at you, Arms Master.
That's the one that popped into my head. Yeah.
And he's not the only one. But yeah, I mean, the characters being such a draw, and with there being so many, I feel like, you guys are bound to have your own favorites, and I've certainly got my own favorites. Any characters you guys found particularly interesting or drawn to? Because I feel like that could almost be whole episodes of content on their own, just discussing individual characters in this story.
Andy, you first.
Oh, sure. Put me on the spot. Well, the one recent one that I've really enjoyed is Weld. He is, I was always kind of drawn to, I think it was Colossus in the X-Men. Some similarities there, but just, he's able to, and I guess a little bit of similarity from the bad cyborg from Terminator 2, but just he's one of the folks that got a bad batch and is kind of a messed up parahuman, but he is making the most of it and has got a really good head on his shoulders and doesn't get rattled, even though he's not, hasn't been doing it very long. And the parts where he was pulling folks out of echidna and realizing what he could do because of that, and he and Skidder were kind of tag teaming a little bit. I really appreciated that and really enjoyed Weld's character in those chapters and arcs.
If I had to commit, I'd probably say Miss Militia with the honorable mention to Legend, I think. Um, because Legend is the quintessential good guy, you know.
Mm.
He's as close to Superman in character aspect, I think, as anybody. Miss Militia, I just, from child in a war torn country to this embodiment of righteousness as far as the heroes go. And plus her power is pretty cool. It's not flight, it's not invincibility, but it's a pretty cool power, and she wields it pretty well, and she's a good leader. I like her as a leader.
Yeah, I think those are really good choices. I mean, I think they both are excellent leaders for their respective teams, and those two are like three, I suppose, if you include Legend, who also a fantastic leader. They embody a lot of the traits that are the best parts of heroes. They are determined, and they are doing their best to do right, regardless of their circumstances, regardless of what power they have been left with, regardless of where they come from and the history and the way people treat them and have treated them. They are still looking in the world and going, yeah, we've seen the bad, and that's why we want to preserve the good, which is very compelling in its own way. Like, a character doesn't have to be dark and edgy and, morally ambiguous to be compelling. Sometimes it's very compelling just to see characters, despite their struggles, making a point of doing good. Weld has not had an easy life. He still has a difficult life,
Right.
because of the way his body works. Miss Militia, you already said, she came from a very dark, bad place and had moved and had to move to the US as an immigrant, as a refugee, with a power that she can't really hide very well. and
Yeah.
just that is perpetually a threatening presence because of what it is, and had to adjust, and she still became this like very compelling. Like she's one of those characters that's well too to an extent, but Miss Militia especially is one of those characters that how much you like her kind of sneaks up on you. I don't know a better way to describe it. It's like she's so understated for a long time, and then after a while you realize, wait, when did you become so prevalent and compelling?
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
As for myself, I
Well,
think if I listed all of my favorites, we'd be here for a very long time. So I'll just handpick a couple. We've talked a lot about Taylor a lot, so there's no real need to go into her. I have very much enjoyed. I like Amy a lot. I think she is a very interesting character.
Mm. Hmm.
Other than that, I think probably Rachel and Parian are pretty up there as well.
Rachel, yeah, I just talked about her. We had a question from one of our regular contributors about some characters and or some moments that stood out to us. And there was one moment that I referenced with regards to Rachel and Skitter. It was again trying to avoid a major spoil after Skitter had taken out their boss. And Daniel, I'm sure you remember that moment where in the van where Rachel reaches over and holds Taylor's hand in a symbol of friendship. I thought that was
Huge.
given the journey, yeah, given the journey that this character has taken, I thought that was a very humanizing moment.
Yeah, I mean, Rachel is from the beginning. You don't think like her very first introduction. You don't realize how compelling a character she's going to be. You think, so you're the
Hmm.
problem in the group, and then after realizing,
Sure.
you come to realize that you are so misunderstood and you have it so unfair. Like, and watching like Taylor piece together how Rachel's mind works and the struggles that she's gone through because of the way she has to think, and the very genuine bond that they build up, and like the very real friendship they build up as they sort of work out how to navigate each other as members of a team, as friends, and just as people is fascinating. It's very compelling, and it's one of the warmer parts of like Worm, which is really nice. And Amy's whole struggle is also, I mean, multi levels of struggle, because her situation with a glory girl is also, oh boy, there's a lot to
Yeah,
unpack there. Just
complicated.
just that family situation in general is a lot to unpack over time. So you factor that in, and what she did, without spoiling anything, is absolutely not okay. But it's so easy to
Hmm.
understand how that happened. She did say stay away, and
mm.
her sister didn't. uh,
Ye-
which people often forget. People go real hard, Amy, about that. But it's like she said,
Hmm.
"Don't touch me."
yeah, she warned him, and she warned, don't make me try to heal my dad
Yeah,
or stepdad. But yeah, I really enjoyed the part about Amy creating the bugs for Skitter, you
Hmm.
know, and that you touched on that a little bit about kind of the limitations of powers and that kind of thing, and then how they tried to circumvent those a little bit, and the relay bugs and
that's
the
really cool.
giant beetle. I love that
Atlas,
part of
yeah.
it. Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean that's the thing. Like, she's one of those characters in the story who is ludicrously powerful. She can heal almost anything just with a touch, except for herself.
Right.
And one of the things I like about her is that rather than exploring, oh, she's so powerful, she can do it. It's yeah, she can, and it's making her life miserable.
Right.
Yes. Hmm.
Because any minute she's not healing someone, curing cancers, or mending broken spines, or whatever. Uh,
And that's a fascinating thing because who would think to make that the dynamic of that character? As you note, she's a very powerful character, and yet her power is bringing her misery when she's not using it to help people. That moment where she references how upset she was when she was at a hospital and there was a toddler with a major birth defect, and she hated herself for one moment for considering not healing that kid because then the pressure would be off her.
That's a really interesting aspect of a character to explore. And, she's not the only one who explores similar paths. I think Taylor actually has a lot in common personality-wise with Amy. And
How did you like the theme of bullying throughout the story?
yeah, I think that the bullying theme is actually really interesting. It's especially given how like powers come about in the Worm universe. I think it's a very
Mhm.
believable origin point for someone who starts out wanting to become a hero. I also think it's very understandable how that would actually push you over time to villainy, especially if the people who are nice to you are villains. And I feel like it's one of those things that it's mostly a thing that's particularly prevalent with Taylor, but it's not the only place you see it because it's how the merchants function as a group. For example,
Mhm.
it's very much how Shadowstalker interacts with the other wards. The way she treats Vista, I don't know if you've gotten to that part, but the way she treats Vista in that one segment is
Mm.
awful. That poor girl. Oh god, that's another interesting character we should have talked about. Oh well. That poor kid.
Yeah,
It's
I liked Vista too. Um, what a character to bring in in this world, this violent world, and also to make her one of the more powerful capes. And you get that that youth and that occasional not naivete. Oh, the word escapes me at the moment, but um her persona is extremely well presented to the reader. And see, I enjoy seeing things from her point of view during, I guess, a couple of the interludes where we get her relating to some of her fellow wards.
Yeah, I mean, she partly because she's so powerful and because she's been an active cape for so long, despite her like young age. She hates being treated like a child and things like that. But also, like she's so desperate to grow up because she's becoming so fatalistic that she's like,
Mhm.
I'm you can't treat me like a child because I don't have a childhood anymore. You know, I'm it,
Mm.
I feel like she could probably bond a lot with Miss Militia because she's basically a child soldier, and it's one of the biggest tragedies is watching her in Worm losing, having having already lost so much of like her innocence, and she's like what 12?
Yeah, 12 or 13, I
She might
believe.
age up partway through this. I mean, she definitely ages up at some point in the story, but
Mhm.
yeah, something like that. It's like. And that's just another hint as to the world is kind of messed up. Like, you understand how the wards came to be, this idea of that, like, young people are going to have powers. It's much
Right.
better if we expose them to the idea of heroin. I nearly said heroin. That's not correct. Heroism.
No, that's Dinah.
Oh, speaking of children who've got it rough.
Oh
Yeah.
man.
Uh, this idea of heroism at a younger age and get them on the path to being heroes because villains outnumber heroes, and given again how powers come to be, it's very easy to understand why. So we try and get them on the right path, and we regulate them, and we
Mhm.
like regulate what aspects of it they're interacting with, and then over time, a lot of that foundation of gradual exposure to the realities of being hero eroded away out of necessity, and that's like fantastic world building, but it's also just another element of the world that it's very internally consistent and kind of just sad.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, I got off a bit of a tangent there. We started with bullying. I was immediately like, "Oh yeah, Vista exists." But it is like, again, it's mostly prevalent with Taylor and with the like internal politics of the wards because of
Mhm.
Shadowstalker's presence and things like that. But it's a very consistent presence throughout the story, especially because of how big an impact and how consistent it is in Taylor's life. But it's not just present there, because people all over the place are throwing their weight around.
Mm-hmm. Thinking about that, I want to touch on one of the scenes that really moved me early on. That scene where Taylor finally opens up to her father about who the bullies were. This was after she and her dad had gone to the school and tried to get some redress from the administration. And oh, correct, it was Andy. Help me out. I think this was after she popped um, Emma in the mall,
Right.
and
Yeah.
her and her
Yeah.
dad. She broke down in the car as they were driving home. Oh, that's what it was. Okay, pardon me, my mind's ricocheting all over the place. After she popped her in the mall, she and her dad were driving home, and she broke down and said that Emma was one of the bullies. And that moment where he pulls over and just embraces his daughter and tries to comfort her. These two poor people, these two people whose relationship gets, as I said earlier, gets pretty badly broken at a later date. It's one of those tender moments that I enjoyed.
Daddy is such a good character. Not
Yeah.
just from the not just from the sense of the fact he's a good, like, well written, interesting, compelling character, which is very cool considering he has no powers or anything in a story about powers. Well, not about powers, but largely people with them. But
Mhm.
like, he's just so easy to like.
We are. Let me confirm something with Andy. Have you finished Arc 20 yet, Andy?
Let me check here. I don't think so.
Okay, because that was going to color a comment I was going to make.
No, haven't
Okay,
finished it yet.
then I'm not going to bring that up. Excuse me there, Daniel. I wanted to make sure where my buddy was.
It's okay. My brain right now is going. Is Arc 20 is that the one?
No, there's let me see if I can pull out another one of my favorite Daniel and pardon me, Danny and Taylor moment. The first night when she ran off from home, the moment where she's trying to shield him at the explosion at the town hall, their relationship, yeah, the first part of Arc 20 where she lays down a decision about whether or not she's going to return to school, and Andy felt a certain kind of way about their dynamic at this point in the story.
Okay, it's there. Okay, I thought you were. I can never remember exactly where certain things are, but I mean, I'm pretty sure you
Sure.
finished the story and knew exactly what I meant when I said that bit. But
yeah, I think so. But
oh, you've got some
Andy,
stuff coming for you, Andy.
yeah, he does. Andy, you thought that at this moment in the story that Taylor should have had more of an edge in her relationship with her father.
What do you mean exactly by edge? I'm not sure.
When you felt when she was talking with Danny, and he was trying to talk her into going back to school, and
Oh,
you felt that
have
you should have just said, "No, I'm not going to go. I'd rather do X."
yeah, I thought she should be a little bit more direct about it.
Yeah.
Given everything that had happened, it seemed appropriate. But again, I'm guessing other readers struggled with, 1 minute she's the queen bee villainous mastermind, and then the next minute, oh, she's a 16-year-old about to go back to high school. So it's kind of hard for me to switch gears sometimes, and I lose track of that a little bit.
I think it's easy to forget that the person, the 16-year-old struggling to balance all of this, who's kind of just flailing a lot of the time and making very hard decisions and legitimately struggling to be the queen bee, is who she really is.
For sure, yeah.
When the mask comes on, Skidder is an act in a lot of ways. Not as much of an act as you might think. She would still make those same choices as Taylor, I feel. But the persona, the portrayal of confidence, of power, is so important in the world she lives in as a cape, presentation is half the battle. So I could see how you might forget that it is presentation, and the reality isn't that she isn't Skidder. The reality is Taylor, and Taylor loves her dad and wants to do the right thing and doesn't want their relationship to be broken and to break. That's why she doesn't draw a line in the sand and say, no, I'm not going. She says, I don't remember exactly what it's been a while since I actually read it, but she basically says, if you tell me to go, I'll go, but please don't.
That's a pretty fair way of looking at it, I think. I mean, go ahead.
I'm glad. Like, I think it's good that he recognizes that he shouldn't push it, because I don't think their relationship would have recovered. I think it would have been over at that point, because I don't think she could really commit to school at that point, given everything going on in her life. I think she would have failed with that commitment.
How enjoyable was it for you, Daniel, that she was not perfect in all her efforts, that
I love it.
some of her decision making was just wrong?
Characters live and die by their flaws. There is nothing less interesting than a character who is perfect. So the fact that she is struggling, that she doesn't always make the correct decision, that her moral perspective is complicated and in some ways a little bit warped because of where she comes from and what she's seen and done. I love that. I think it makes her a more compelling and more interesting character. That's one of the things that draws me to Worm. The reason I've come back and reread it, despite its enormous length several times, is that there are no perfect people. And when I say perfect people, I mean perfectly good or perfectly evil. People have strengths and they have flaws, and it makes them feel more realistic, and it makes them easier to connect to, and it makes them more compelling. So I really like that Taylor is a very flawed person. Like, her philosophy, it's very easy to understand where so much of it comes from. Like, at the base of it, she just wants everyone to work together to be better, you know. To cut through the red tape and the bullshit and the performances and just do what she thinks is the right thing.
And see, there's the thing. What she thinks is the right thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, a lot of the time I do agree with, like, her stance on is this morally correct, but a lot of the time as well, it's like, it's a little dubious. Like, a lot of that red tape exists for a reason, you know. I understand a lot of her criticisms of the status quo and why she thinks things need to change, because she's right about a lot of it, but there's a lot of things she's wrong about too. Like, I can't get into it too much, but because it's going to be a big thing in later arcs, some of that. But yeah, I think it makes her a much more compelling and believable protagonist. I think it's the same. I think it's what makes Gru interesting as a character is his personal philosophy and morality. I think that applies to a lot of characters, to be honest, on both sides of the aisle and also neutral.
Yeah, I was just going to say, reiterating something as we're talking. I think one of the interesting things is that I had to be drugged kicking and screaming into accepting the fact that Dale Taylor was going to be a villain, and she was serious about it at this point in the story. And I'm just kind of like, well, okay, I guess we're going to just have to roll with it.
Yeah, I can see why you had some concern. You didn't want to see her, like, become a totally different character. I assume, like, you didn't want to see this become just.
Well, no, I think that it was, again, as a normie, as in superheroes, I expected the traditional route, and when I wasn't getting it, I kind of pouted. But I soldiered on, and it was like, okay, well, this actually is kind of interesting, and let's see where Wildbow is taking her.
It's interesting, like, that you say that again, because, like, that's like the inverse of the experience I had when I went into it, going, okay, here we go again, another superhero story. Never mind. But yeah, I think that just in general, I really appreciate characters with flaws. I think it's a lot like what we were saying about like magic systems earlier, right? Is that with powers, the limitations are more interesting than the powers themselves. It's the limitations and the flaws and the weaknesses that make a power interesting. And I think in not to the same extent necessarily, because a character's good points are interesting and compelling too. But I think that a lot of the time a character's positives are highlighted and made interesting by their flaws and vice versa. I mean, as a writer myself, like I very much have emphasized a lot that I think contrast is incredibly important in storytelling. You can't have something be all positive, all negative, because then the lack of contrast means that the positive becomes not that interesting, or the negative becomes not that interesting because it's all there is.
Yeah, in and of itself, it just kind of
They
just
highlight each other, yeah.
yeah, that contrast makes the story dynamic. Otherwise, it's just kind of bland, either all good or all bad, but it's bland.
Yeah, exactly. It's the contrasts add nuance, they add depth, and that makes things much more interesting. And it makes characters feel more like people. And I think like one of the biggest rules I have for storytelling, and that I hope I succeed in following myself, is that characters are people and therefore should feel like people. Obviously, you can't make a character as complicated as a real person. That's not possible. Books aren't long enough. And it would be difficult. It would be too difficult to follow at times. Like, you need to simplify from actual person, but they should still feel like people, not like a walking plot device. And I think that's one of the biggest strengths in Worm, is that everyone feels like a person.
I would agree with that.
I would as well. Yeah.
It says a lot that all three of us have been coming from like very, or at least somewhat different places, and have all found the same things in the story that we like, more or less. I think that's
And as I said, the things
quality.
that right, and as I said before, not to be repetitive, the chance to bounce this off of someone like Andy is what's helped make this so fun for me. You got to give you a little bit of history of our friendship. We've been friends since the mid '80s, and we were college roommates, and we would sit around and talk about books that we read, or we'd go see movies and so forth, and spend hours like any couple of nerds would. And the fact that I figured he would find an interest in this story, and it bore out. And we're at this different place in our lives now, and we can still connect and discuss the nuances of these characters and and the storyline itself. The work that Wild Bolt put out has managed to draw the two of us back together and discuss things like we used to do sitting in our apartment years ago.
I mean, that's a good thing in and of itself. So we respect it. Thank you, Wildbow. But I think it also highlights something interesting that you talked about earlier. Is you said that you feel like Worm as a story is very directed at young people, right? And I don't think that's wrong. I do think it is sort of more of a YA focused thing. It's largely centered around the younger characters. Although there's a lot of older characters who are very compelling as well. But I don't think it is. It's not like a lot of stories that are like primarily directed at. No, I'm saying that wrong. Actually, let me backtrack a little bit. I think that a good philosophy to have for a story is within reason for the story you are telling, to make it as accessible and compelling to as wide a demographic as possible. And I think generally speaking that is the mark of a good story, is that if you can read it at like, I don't know, 16, for example, and then read it again at 30 and you still find things that you like in that story and that you enjoy, if you can still enjoy that at those different ages, that's a good story. And that's something I really endeavor to do with my own writing. Like, I don't know if I succeed. I don't know if I'm, I try my best, but it's something that is very much my philosophy, is that target audience is a marketing thing. Within reason. I want my stories to be able to be read by as many people as possible, and that's, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I was just saying, and I think that is something that Wildbow has very much succeeded at, is that in this, so far I've read 3 of his stories, and in all of them I think that the characters are relatable and understandable and compelling from many different angles and many different places in life, and I think that's a very good thing.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And yeah, to piggyback on that, my son is an avid reader as well. He's in his 20s now, and I can remember looking at some of the young adult stuff he was reading, and the main theme was all about the struggles of being a teenager. There were things that were going on outside of that. There were other themes, but at its heart, it was all about, wow, I'm a teenager. I can't own a house yet. I can't go do this yet. And, I have all these constraints and everything, but I'm almost like an adult. And it was all this just kind of maneuvering around that. But to your point about multiple themes, I think of the story Dune. I read that first when I was about Paul's age, and it really, really struck me. I could really relate to a lot of the stuff, and was really excited about, wow, he just keeps reaching new levels. And then the movie came out, and somebody made the mistake of saying, oh yeah, this is just like the book. And I'm like, it's been a while since I read it, but I'm pretty sure it's not. And so I went back and read it, and I was like, just what you were saying, Daniel. Okay, I'm not Paul's age anymore, but this is an amazing story still. It's got all these other excellent aspects about it, the political aspects of it, all the power struggles throughout the galaxy and everything. And so I heartily agree. Wildbow does the same thing with this story.
Yeah, I think it's just a good idea as a general rule, is to write the story you want to write. Focus on making the story nuanced and compelling and good. I know that some of that's subjective, but write the best story you can, and then figure out after who that story is appropriate for. Because, I mean, look, I'm not a bestseller. I'm probably not someone who should be talking about marketing. It is by far the thing I'm worst at when it comes to being an author. But I genuinely do think that if you set out to write a young adult story from the very beginning, before anything else, you go, that's what I'm going to do. That's what you're going to do. You're going to write a very formulaic, typical YA story, for example. If you go, this is my concept, I want to write this story, I'm going to write it my way, and then at the end you go, right, children should not read this. That's fine. That's okay. And then you know where to direct that. But you've written your story in your way, and it's probably going to be better for it. I label my book as a YA story. I don't, and I have somewhat promoted myself as a YA writer. I'm not. I don't think that's really true. It's just that I think there is a starting point for the maturity that you are likely to be able to deal with a lot of the kind of messed up things I write about, to be honest. So I was like, right, I'll label this as as appropriate for ages, I think I said 12 plus. But the reality is, it's probably going to want to tend a little bit older. But I was reading, Stephen King books when I was 10 and 11. So,
oh wow.
I was reading murder mysteries that my mum was reading.
Wow.
So, and then I'd pick up the Inheritance books the next day. So maybe I've got a warped perspective on that. I don't know, but I think I personally feel like that is a good philosophy to have as a storyteller in general, whether that's books or TV. And I do think a lot of like current like young attending TV stuff and streaming stuff is starting to apply more of that philosophy too. And I think it's definitely very present in Wildbow's work. So I like seeing that other people have picked up on this and have come into it from different parts of like places in their lives, because you guys are obviously a little bit older than me.
Yeah, I was all credit to my stepson because I was really skeptical about this thing. Um, I know what his interests were as far as genre entertainment, and so after 2 years or so of him pursuing me to read this thing, I reluctantly got into it, and because Wildbow wrote a broad story that was accessible to someone of my age, hey, it lured me in. And okay, this is an interesting character. Let's see where she goes. Oh, she's got an interesting family and then in school life. And oh, superheroes happen to be in the story. And there's some politics and all that stuff is what kind of snowballed into keeping me invested in the story for the incredible length that it is.
Yeah, I feel like Worm as a story, right, was very ahead of its time. Like,
Hmm.
I mean, obviously, like more superhero stories that are a bit darker or grittier or have a little bit more realism, they've existed for a while. The '90s happened, but as far as like a nuanced take on the idea, like this dose of realism, the idea that it's not real, like it's not realism because it's dark. The darkness is because of the realism.
Hmm.
You know, any of the grit and darkness in Worm, that's not what makes it like a realistic story. That's all byproducts of the realism injected, the like way the society is constructed. I feel like that more. I keep saying nuance, but it's such a good word to describe the way that it's written.
Yeah,
Uh,
because Andy, I think we at one point had talked about our disappointment, our supreme disappointment in Arms Master after the Leviathan
Mm.
fight.
Yeah. Yeah. He was definitely kind of threw me off. His early interactions with Skitter kind of raised a little bit of a red flag for me. And I was a little bit concerned about it. He seemed like he was maybe a little bit of a double dealer, but then, yeah, the Leviathan stuff really was a letdown. But again, in hindsight, it's kind of like, well, you're going to have people in all sorts of different headspaces, and you're going to have those folks that are like supremely ambitious,
Hmm.
realizing that maybe they're not as amped up as other people, and so they're going to maybe cut corners, maybe try for other advantages, and think that it's okay. They'll find a justification for it. And it just went really wrong in that instance. And I'm interested to see where his character goes from here now that he's uh, teamed up with Dragon so closely, and um, seeing what's going to happen with that.
I think
Yeah,
you'll find it
we
very enjoyable.
yes, thank you, Daniel. Yeah, absolutely. That is going to go someplace. There's a payoff for you at some point in the not too distant future. I think we can say that. Yeah, Daniel.
I think that's reasonable to say. That where you are in the story right now, in the not too distant future, a lot of very dramatic and very satisfying things are going to happen. Also, to be fair, like I'll be completely, I don't want to set up things and be like that everything is going to be perfect all the way through, because there's no such thing
Oh
as a
no.
perfect story. And there is like a chunk of the story ahead after some of the more dramatic stuff. A very small chunk, in fairness, given the enormous size of the story, where some of the pacing's a bit for me, but it picks up very quickly after that as well.
Yeah, there's an event that's going to take place. We're not too far off from that. And Andy, I'm the subject of some debate in
Mm.
the worm community, and so I will be looking forward to getting your take on when this particular thing transpires and how the story moves after this thing,
Right.
and gonna make for some interesting conversation, I think.
I'm gonna have to get you to email me. Tell me when the thing happened.
I look
I'm
forward to it.
gonna have to listen to more to like properly get through. Like, I've not really been able to set aside time to really go through and properly listen to your podcast, and I would really like to because I think it'll be very interesting. Because I love seeing people experience this story for the first time because it's always very entertaining. So, I do intend to make a point of going through and giving your podcast a proper listen.
Well, we certainly want to extend an invitation to you to join us on our little corner of the internet at some point in the not too distant future.
Yeah, I mean, I would love that. I think it would be a lot of fun. I very much have enjoyed doing this so far with you guys this episode. In fact, if you want to have me on when the thing happens, I'm down.
All right.
Sounds like a plan.
Because I could say a lot about that. For the time being, though, I've just actually looked at the time on our recording and gone, oh, it's been a bit, hasn't it?
Oh
So
my.
we can probably wrap this up there before I take another 3 hours to talk about this story and miss my next appointment.
All right.
So, for you guys who are listening to this on Spotify or probably not Google Podcasts because of the time of recording that's going away, you can also find these episodes on my site, radfordwrites.com. I know statistically that's where most of you find it anyway, but it's always worth mentioning. You can also read some of my stories there, and I do blog posts and articles about stuff there. And there's also links to buy my books, which I always appreciate people doing. And if you guys want to plug yourselves, go right ahead.
Yeah, we're Keith and Andy. We are from Sonora Desert Media, and we have a tiny but ambitious little podcast called the Brockton Bay Chronicles, where I take my buddy Andy through his first time reading of Worm, and we kick around some of the story elements and the characters that we find interesting. You can find us on YouTube and on Spotify.
Yeah, and I mean, if this conversation has been any indicator, they have a lot of interesting thoughts on the subject matter, and they're going. And unlike this one brief episode, they're doing it arc by arc, so you could really get into the depth of it there, which I think is good. Wow, wonderful. My job is words, and I just defaulted to I think it's good. I think it's fantastic. It is a wonderful,
Thank you.
mind-altering experience. Go listen to their podcast too.
Well, thanks for having us on, man.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no worries.
really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Thank you for coming, and I would love to have you guys back again sometime.
Count on it.
Sounds good.
Until then, we can leave it there.